Because of the following special program, Wonder Woman and the Incredible Hulk will not be presented this evening.
That's not true. That's impossible.
It's time to get all your Star Wars news in a single file. This is Making Tracks. Here are your hosts, Mark Newbold and Dave Tree.
That's not true. That's impossible.
Thanks, Dave. All right, so as you can see from the slide, pleasure to be here in Argentina. So I was recently at a convention in Argentina, a Star Wars convention. We were traveling all over South America. Went to Bolivia, where they filmed the planet Crate in The Last Jedi. And it was interesting, when we were in Argentina, they had, and this is something I think you guys could relate to, they had these signs everywhere that said, Las Malvinas son Argentinas, which translates to the Falklands are Argentinian. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there for this audience. I don't know if that's a widely held view. But anyway, so what I'm going to do is take you through a personal journey. I created this talk first for Celebration, and it was after years of getting a lot of questions. Many of you are advanced collectors, and many of you have done things for the collecting community. So some of it is not, some of it's not new information for you, but what I was trying to do was demystify what it takes to go through years of collecting. Because I think a lot of us, run into collectors who are newer collectors, and they want to sort of jump to the stage you're at and not understand how many years of, different kinds of contributions you've made and unpack what it takes to sort of get into the collecting community. And so what I was trying to do with this is help people understand that it takes a long time, and there are lots of ways you can contribute. You don't have to necessarily follow the way I did it, but there's lots of ways all of you do podcasts and websites and all sorts of things, and so all of those kind of contribute back to the community. So that's what sort of this is about. So I wanted to just first go through my background on my collection. I think some of you know this, but Dave, you can just flip ahead through the whole slide. So I collect, I collect in a few categories in depth. I think a lot of times people think I collect everything. I don't. I have about 6 categories that I go really deep in. So one of them is original movie props and costumes from the Star Wars movies. So some examples are, this is a Stormtrooper helmet from Return of the Jedi. This is a small AT-AT Walker miniature from Empire Strikes Back. This is a display case of different screen-used blasters from the movies. Move forward. And then I also collect toy prototypes. So this is a Han Solo in the Hoth outfit that was handmade by a Kenner employee for consideration from the toy line, and it was a prototype with the box. This is a sculpt of Chewbacca action figure. So in toys, I like to find things that are really unique, one of a kind, and tell the history of the toys. Move on. All right. So what I want to just cover very briefly is that a few sort of themes in collecting is that demystify that the Star Wars collecting, that it really is sort of takes many years and it's iterative. Anyone can do it, and there are no real rules. Like one of the things you always hear, you guys see it on forums where people try to assert rules, like real collecting is this, and I think most of that's total bullshit. Like I think that the rules are whatever you want to apply to yourself, and I don't believe, even though obviously, as you guys know, more money in buying stuff helps, I don't think that most collectors are rich, and I don't think deep pockets are required in collecting that, and I don't think you have to be a first mover. You don't have to be the people that had, were adults at the time Star Wars came out. Like I've seen many examples of people who've come late to the hobby who've been able to make a lot of ground up very quickly. But I do believe that collecting requires research and patience, networking, friendships, budgeting, inspiration. It's multifaceted. It isn't just one thing. When I hear collectors say it's all about knowledge or it's all about negotiation on prices, I think that that's very limited. I think that collecting is multifaceted, and to be very successful at collecting, you have to kind of be good at a bunch of things. And I think sharing back to the community is part of it all. So. Move on, Dave. So, just quickly, before I started Star Wars collecting, as a kid, I collected baseball cards. and it was interesting as a little kid. This is before Star Wars came out. I collected the cards from the years that I was as a kid. So they'd come out every year. Topps would issue a new set, and very quickly, at a very young age, so like around 8 years old, I was 7 years old. I was wanted cards from like a generation before me. So I knew of like really famous baseball players in the Hall of Fame. And so I figured out at that age how to find dealers and how to find like really advanced cards, like cards that are now worth a lot of money and highly sought after of like very famous baseball players. And so here's some examples. I mean, several of these, like the cards actually all of those cards are sort of before my time. And so I learned that like, don't limit yourself to just what you can buy at a store. It's like every other kid I knew would only buy baseball cards and what they could find at their local store. And I was like, I want I'm going to shoot for what I want, and I'm going to set parameters of what I'm interested in and not be constrained by what a dealer or retailer tells me I should buy. And at a very young age, it taught me that like, don't be constrained by that. Because I think a lot of collectors go like, well, I'm going to buy what's at Walmart, instead of saying, no, I'm going to figure out what I want, and I'm not going to worry about how hard it is. I'm just going to go for it. So that was the lesson I learned from baseball cards. Let me move on. And then I was also a coin collector. I collected like a number of like U.S. coins, and coin collecting has its own kind of culture that's existed for decades. And really, about condition is king in coin collecting, and whatever kind of, whether you collect currencies or just coins or special coins. And but part of my story with coins was really like going out there and being creative about collecting. So I collected like older US coins initially, and then I had this conversation with my father, who said, oh yeah, he had, as a kid, collected coins, and he had all these coins that and to quick background, my family grew up in Cuba. I moved over to the United States when I was 3. And so when you leave Cuba and go to the United States, the process is like, when you do it officially, the process is like the government seizes pretty much every asset you own, everything you own. And so what my father did is he gave the coins that he had, this pretty reasonable sized coin collection, to my great-grandfather, and just left it with him in Cuba because he couldn't take it with him. You weren't allowed to take anything with you. So anyway, we figured this out, and somehow, as I got interested in coins, I said, so whatever happened to those coins? And my great-grandfather still had them in Cuba. And by some miracle, he managed to get them smuggled out through a friend in Spain and got them to me. And so I got all these coins, and I took it to a coin dealer, and the coin dealer's like, holy crap, these were like pieces of 8 and coins from the 16th century, all these amazing coins. And I was like, okay, I guess I got pretty lucky here. They had all these like incredible coins in it. But again, it was like really like, again, at a very young age, this is all before Star Wars, trying to think out of the box of how to get unusual stuff. So I still actually have these coins that I got from my father. So move on. And then toys, pre-Star Wars, I liked various action figure toys. So I was already into action figures. I loved Evel Knievel. I was a huge fan of that. It was my favorite toy at the time. G.I. Joe, or Action Man here. And then the Mego 8-inch action figures. So I was already into action figures, and so that sort of set me up as like action figures were my favorite sort of genre of toys. And then, of course, as all of you know, summer 1977. A little later over here, Star Wars came out, and for me, I had never been into science fiction. I'd never been into this kind of film genre, but it changed my life as it changed the lives of all of you. And so I was just an instant Star Wars fanatic. Saw it so many times that summer, and at that time was buying everything I could find. So it was the Topps cards, it was every Marvel comic, everything, the novelization, etc. Of course, that had a big impact on my life. And the first stuff I had were the blue cards from Topps. They were as you know, like the first year they mostly only had printed materials that were easy to crank out. They were my gateway drug into collecting. And then, of course, I got all the subsequent series from Topps. Move on. And then in the first year, of course, the toy line was, they had not planned for it. Kenner had negotiated the license to have Star Wars toys, but they weren't ready in production. Nobody expected the hit of Star Wars, and all they had really in that first year was this early bird certificate. I bought one of these in a store, and I was like anxiously awaiting for the first action figures, and so that was my first foray into Star Wars action figures. And so, you hear a lot about the early bird kit now as a collector, but it's hard to actually find people that remember buying it and had it. I had it as a kid, and I was like anxiously waiting for those figures to arrive, and that sort of started me down that track. And then, there were other things at the time, like comic books, fan club had a bunch of stuff, unique stuff, magazines, puzzles, food items. This was my bedroom in that circa first couple years. Like you can see, examples of it. You can see my vintage action figures, and I had them on display. I had like some posters and so on. There's like an 8-track tape player there. There's like a bunch of very dated stuff, but that was my collection. Up to like about 1978. And then I'd been collecting through all the years of the first Star Wars movies, and like many other people, like you have other things sort of happen to you. So you go away to school, or you have relationships, or you have a career, and all these things kind of are competing for your time and your interest. And at the same time, it also happened to coincide with the Star Wars dark time. So I had stayed with the fan club till they ended it. I had stayed with the Marvel comics till they ended it. So I was, well into like the mid 80s, I was pretty active, but it was like, as sort of like interest in Star Wars waned, there was nothing else for me. So I sort of got detached from it, which was pretty good timing in some sense, because at the time I moved from New Jersey, where I grew up, to the West Coast in Seattle. I went to graduate school, and it really was after that move that I really got back into Star Wars. And what happened was, on my way to grad school every day, I'd walk past 2 comic shops that had vintage Star Wars toys in the window. This is like circa early 90, 91, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to go get back into Star Wars. I'm going to find all the toys I never got, and then I'm going to stop there. I'm just going to get all the toys I didn't get. So you move on. But then all these things were happening. The Timothy Zahn novels, we had the Dark Empire comics, Steve Sansweet's amazing book of Concept to Screen, a collectible, and then I started the Star Wars news group on the internet, and for me that was like, okay, I'm really getting into this. It's starting to build up for me, and I finally did a trip back to my parents. I knew I had saved all my original Star Wars toys, but I didn't want to I delayed my reemergence into vintage collecting until I got my original toys back so I could build from there. And every time I'd go visit my parents in New Jersey, they'd always say, oh no, like I never could find them. And I know they didn't throw them away. And there was this one room in the house that they wouldn't let me search in. They were like, oh, your dad's stuff is in there. He's got it all organized. Don't go in there. So finally one trip I said, you know what, I'm going in there. And of course all the Star Wars stuff was there. And then I brought it all back. And I told my wife, when I got back, said, you know what? I found my action figures. I got a few more to get, and then I'm going to be done. That'll be my Star Wars collection. And of course, she loves to quote that back to me all the time because I've not only said it that time, I've said that famous last words many times in this hobby. So moving on. But one of the things, and this is sort of advice I give so I really wanted to get back into action figure collecting about 1991 or so, but actually it got delayed a couple of years from all these trips trying to find my original figures. And once I found them, I did this post. There's actually April 1st, 1993, where basically I posted on one of the news groups about, hey, I want to get back into collecting action figures. And I had a whole bunch of questions. And when you read this now, it's kind of funny because it's like, okay, well, first of all, it reminds me there's a humility to this, which is that all of us were beginners at one point. Like, this is me as a beginner, my first sort of post on Star Wars collecting. But one of the things that I look back at this, that I sort of try to guide beginners to, is that there's some very reasonable questions here, right? Like, I knew there were people out there collecting. I suppose that there were. And I said, well, where can I find them? Are there local places I can go to? Are there periodicals, magazines where I can find them? And how do I get a good gauge on prices? I mean, so I think a lot of times, you'll see novices come in and they'll ask, questions where they want to be sort of spoon-fed everything, and sort of where I was going was, look, I know there's information out there, I want to learn from the good sources, point me to the sources, and I'm going to go learn. And so, but anyway, I like to show this because it's sort of a reminder that all of us were beginners at one time. So the other thing I want to, sort of counter-argue is the collectors that get sort of elitist and look down on novices, like, well, hey, there was a day when all of us were learning too. And so, it's good. You never know if some of today's novices are going to be these great collectors that will all help us out and uncover all sorts of great stuff for us. So anyway, that was where it really started for me. So it was this delay until I had my action figures back. So back in the day, I think some of you remember this, before eBay, the place to buy toys globally really was Toy Shop magazine. And one of the things, Toy Shop was amazing. It was like all sorts of discoveries of Star Wars, and we learned about a lot of worldwide stuff because you had dealers from all over the world advertising in it. And even as a student, so back in the day when I was getting Toy Shop as a student, I was on a shoestring budget. Like I was living off a student wage, and so hardly had any money to spend on collecting. But yet I was paying to have this thing overnighted to me every 2 weeks. Like it was so critical to collecting that it was worth paying overnight delivery of Toy Shop, because that few days edge over everybody else to get Toy Shop. And I don't know if any of you, show of hands, who ever got Toy Shop back in the day? I'm curious how many of you. So not many, but
it wasn't something that was really over here.
Oh, really?
We had things like model and collector's mark.
Okay.
The closest equivalent to.
In the U.S., it was much. I have talked to collectors worldwide who did get Toy Shop, but there were a lot of dealers internationally in it. But it was huge in the U.S. And so anyway, that was pre-eBay. You move forward. And then, so one of the things I did early on was I do ads in the newspaper. And so what I did, people tell the cliche about how they went off to school and their parents sold off their Star Wars collection. Well, I was the guy buying up all those Star Wars collections. So I would put ads in the paper, and I would get tons of responses every time I advertised in the newspaper of people that had collections, and it was all vintage at the time. And so I bought up all sorts of vintage collections. And for me, this is what really diversified my taste, because there were several full carded collections I bought, box collections. There would be ceramics and Don Post masks and all sorts of things. It really broadened my interest, and that really helped me really learn about the variety of things in Star Wars and helped broaden my taste. And things like micro collection I didn't collect as a kid, but after, I'd buy a collection that would have a bunch of micro collection stuff, and I would start collecting it. And it really helped me also on a shoestring budget. And so sort of the point of this was that to a lot of audiences where you're talking about this subject is they always think you got to have deep pockets for collecting. I'm like, you don't really. I mean, one of the reasons why many of us get into dealing Star Wars is it allows us to, acquire things at a lower price and subsidize our collection. And that's what I did when I was a student. So that was sort of one of the things is some of the things about money and collecting, what my views are basically everybody has a budget. So even, as advanced in my career, I have more budget than I had as a kid, younger, but you always have a budget. You always have a limit. And, but life needs come first. I have seen some collectors, some of you probably know some collectors who've gone overboard and spend way more than they can afford and get into heavy debt. And for me, I've done some crazy things with money back in the day. I did some bold things where I'm going to take a risk, and I'm going to run up my credit card to get this thing because it's a bargain. It usually played out quite well for me, but I don't recommend that to people because I always make sure I could afford to eat, I could pay the rent, all of that. And it seems like an obvious piece of advice, but unfortunately, some people go that extreme. But I do believe that collectors, there's some tips dealing, as I mentioned, is one way to subsidize it. Another is pruning a collection. I think one of the things that's very important in collecting is that you refine your focus over the years. You don't have to collect the same thing you've always collected. I've done many times where I used to collect replica props. I didn't have space for them anymore, so I sold them off, and that generated some cash to go get other things. So I think it's totally fine to also refocus. I think it's part of being a collector. Keep going. So one of my first really crazy plunges as a student was getting a rocket-firing Boba Fett back in it was circa 94. At the time I was, I had very quickly amassed a pretty good vintage collection, But I had this opportunity to buy this thing for $3,000 at that time, and at the time, so I was as a student, as a grad student, I was paid about $1,000 a month is what my earnings were at that time. So a $3,000 item was like 3 months of my wages to go buy this thing, and I discussed it with my wife. I said, this is kind of crazy, like, make $1,000 a month, I'm going to buy this $3,000 thing, but I have this good feeling about, that this is something that's going to be harder to find later on, it's going to be super expensive later on, and so I took the plunge and did that, and, I ended up eating ramen for many months, so, did all these sacrifices to be able to get this, but it's a decision that I never regretted. Like, it was an extreme thing to do, but it was like, really push the limits of what kind of sacrifice can you make for collecting because you're really into something, and when I've made a few of these decisions in my life, it's always been on something that I just had really good sound conviction that it's a worthwhile thing to go after, and so obviously these things now go for an incredible amount of money. There have been recent auctions where they've gone in like $85,000. But I don't regret decisions like that. It really taught me how to make extreme sacrifices when I need to, but not do that all the time. So networking with, go back one slide, networking with other collectors, a few things there that sort of mentioned to people. So one of the great things about the generation of people who grew up with Star Wars as kids is that it's really the first generation that encountered two things that every other generation in history has never faced. And that is the ability to interact globally with other people, like-minded people in similar interests. If you really think about the emergence of the internet, nobody in history prior to that could ever connect with people in that way. It changed everything, including collecting. And it really was the generation who grew up with Star Wars that were able to do that. And I think that was something very powerful where, in some sense, the sort of Gen X generation that grew up with Star Wars leapfrogged sort of the original if you think about like the original old school collectors who were sort of baby boomer age, like in the 30s and 40s when Star Wars was coming out and had more disposable income, and they were the big collectors of their time. But it was when the kids who grew up with Star Wars got older and really leveraged things like the internet, and in many ways leapfrogged the old school collectors, because the power of communicating and interfacing with each other is just something that was never had been done in history. And so a lot of us participated in this. So we created a Star Wars news group. I played a role in sort of crafting. There was a whole process in that day of a protocol you had to go through to propose a collecting news group, but we got it done. There are people that actually voted against it, which I thought was really weird, that you think it'd be not controversial. We did things like we coined the term, actually go back just one, coined the term vintage. I did things like in Toy Shop Magazine, I connected with other collectors and names that we kept seeing in Toy Shop. I started just phoning them, saw if they had email addresses. So we're starting to build this community, and really we're the first generation to really be active on the internet and leverage this information. So we move to the next slide. Really it's like the first generation with universal access to broadcast media. We're connected globally. And I think the other thing that's also new was cheap air transportation. So it was the first generation in history that could fly all over the world and you not have to be like a billionaire to be able to do that. And that's also game-changing in collecting. I think that the fact that many of you have been to conventions in other countries, like that kind of thing a generation ago was unheard of. And when you take that, you combine that, the amount of information we're gathering worldwide, our ability to communicate with people everywhere, and our ability to travel, just adds a whole dimension to collecting that just didn't exist in collecting before. And so, I also feel like those two things, like the power of networking through the internet and then also the travel, I feel like as a collector, if I weren't taking advantage of those things, I'd feel like I'd be left out. Like there's this incredible opportunity in front of us that many people don't take advantage of. So what I started to do as a collector was start to share information in various places. Like I used to write for Star Wars Galaxy Collector magazine, for Toy Shop, for Action Figure News, and one of the things I used to get from other collectors was, why do you share so much information? You learn about this special thing or new find, and you share all this. Why would you want to do that? Wouldn't it be better to stay in isolation and not share that and give you a competitive advantage? And I've always felt there are definitely times where I've overshared, and it probably was a disadvantage in some short-term sense, but I've always felt like the community sharing information is sort of a rising tide that lifts all boats. Like, I have benefited way more from doing the sharing than I would have if I worked in isolation and didn't share. And it's sort of counterintuitive to some people, because they think that some collectors do think that in isolation and not sharing information is the smartest thing, and I'll just absorb information from everybody. But I can tell you, like, I've lost count of how many incredible opportunities I've gotten because I reach out a lot and share a lot of information. I get a lot of incoming, like some of the props I own, like Luke's original New Hope belt or the Tusken Raider mask I have from the films. That was because I have a website and publicize information and somebody found me. I mean, so I've had many opportunities because I share information. I always encourage others to do that and not be one of those, collectors that sort of, hides in isolation.
Hello, I'm Warwick Davis, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks.
So I mentioned travel. I used to very early on do road trips to other cities. I know many of you do that. And that was, of course, on a shoestring budget. That was something that was very easy for me to do, just drive to these different cities and go to toy shows. And then I started to, when I travel internationally for present at a conference in my research, I would stop over in various countries. This is Wolfgang Schlogel, who's a collector in Germany, and he and I did a deal in 1994. I was flying to the Baltics, and I stopped over in Frankfurt. And he wanted all this micro collection stuff. So I had this suitcase filled with micro collection play sets and stuff. And so we did this deal in the airport, and then I went on my merry way, and then he traded me some stuff in that process. But other things I did early on was also create a collecting group in Seattle. I got that came from an inspiration from travel. My wife and I have been traveling in Australia, and we met some collectors in Tasmania, and I was and they had a whole collecting group in Tasmania, and I thought, wow, if a group in Tasmania can have a collecting group, we can do it anywhere, because there are not that many collectors in Tasmania. And so I went and formed one in Seattle that then was the first of its kind in the United States in 1994, and then now there's a whole bunch of them all over the United States and other parts of the world. And so this is the group Sarlacc. And each collecting group has sort of different kinds of objectives. Sarlacc, what I like to do with any organization I form is sort of mold it in my way, but not be like a dictator over it. So, Sarlacc, we basically had wide demographic. A lot of other collecting groups are very narrow. They're like vintage only or action figure only, or very narrowly focused. But Sarlacc's very diverse, like people of all ages and backgrounds, and we have men and women in the group, and basically our policies are there's no rules, there's no officers, there's no dues, there's no meeting minutes. It's actually basically mildly controlled anarchy, but it actually works really, really well. But it's not the style for every group. Some groups, I've talked to some other groups in the United States where they're actually officially incorporated and they have dues and all that kind of stuff, but we never did that in Seattle. But we've done a lot of events with this group. We visited the filming locations, we've gone to celebration events, we do, the caliber of activity we do is pretty high in this group. But each collecting group has its own culture. Then I built the Star Wars Collectors Archive in 1994. It was the first Star Wars collectibles website on the internet. I remember when I created it, a lot of people criticized it because at the time, so in the early days of particularly websites, there were about 3 or 4 Star Wars websites, and they were very general. They would talk about they talk about the Brian Daly books, and they would talk about speculation of new films, and they talk about the actors and stuff, and they'd have a collecting section and all this. And I came forward and said, well, I'm going to build one just about Star Wars collecting. And people thought, that is the most narrow topic. How can you do a website just about Star Wars collecting? There's not enough information about doing this. And people actually thought it was crazy. And of course, now we've got hundreds and hundreds of very good Star Wars websites on collecting. But originally, it was just the whole idea of the archive was I wanted a place where my friends and I had been building this community, and we needed a place where we could share information and share photos. And I said, well, you know what? I'm just going to build this website, and as we get information, we're going to pool it. And over time, it really evolved into, let's build this kick-ass museum that has the best stuff online that you could find anywhere, and that with the theory that no one collection has the best stuff in the world. That it's really this some of the greatest stuff out there. We'll build something that really you can't emulate, and that was the principle behind it. And I never expected to go as far as it went. And over the years, we evolved some things. We added a database to track every item ever made. So even though we focused on unique items, we had good information about every item ever made. And we did things like we had a role in popularizing things like toy prototypes. That obviously became a thing later on, and several of us working on the archive were very focused on meeting Kenner people and finding unique prototypes. And so when we found them, we'd publish them on the archive. And so, but we were really originally just doing this just to share information with each other. And so part of that was, again, this is like going back to the thinking out of the box thing about as a kid when I was going after baseball cards from a previous generation, or when I was as a kid buying coins, getting coins from other countries that were hundreds of years old. I was like, okay, well, I love the Star Wars toys. I've done a pretty good job getting the vintage toys. What's next? And so some of it was like, well, I love these unproduced things that we discover and these cool things no one knows about from Kenner. So I just, on a whim, just said, you know what, I'm just going to go to Cincinnati. I'm going to look up people who worked at Kenner and just going to start meeting Kenner people. And at that point, no collector had really done that. There were a couple dealers that maybe had run into Kenner collectors, but this was just sort of an idea I came up with, and I started bringing some friends along on these trips. And we'd go to Cincinnati, and which is the home of Kenner, and did this for many years. And it got to the point, there was a point where I was visiting Cincinnati about 6 times a year for like long weekends, and would come back with suitcases full of prototypes and things like that. And we would go methodically through the whole Kenner directory, and I met hundreds of people that worked at Kenner. And really it became this kind of thing, like to go to Cincinnati. But it was like something that was just originally, when I said it to one of my friends, hey, I'm going to go do this, he thought, well, that's kind of crazy and wild, but he decided to join me on the trip, and then from there it snowballed. Although part of it that got weird with the with Kenner trips was, if you've ever seen like Treasure of Sierra Madre, where you have all these people that have this amazing treasure, but they all end up sort of killing each other to get that treasure, instead of saying, well, actually, we got enough treasure that we all should be happy. So the part of it got super competitive with prototype stuff after some years. A lot of dealers and other collectors, and so it got a little nasty for a while, because after people learned about this pattern, there was plenty to go around, but it was just one of those things, like some collectors get very competitive. But again, this opened up all these opportunities many have never considered before. And one of the takeaways I have here is that, okay, so a lot of people look at this and say, okay, well, that window has closed, all the Kenner employees have been tapped, so why are you sharing this? It's not really relevant anymore. But I'm like, Star Wars has had thousands of licensees. People have pretty much only done this with Kenner. Like, if you think of all the other licensees in Star Wars, there's very few where people have really gone through and found the employees. Like, so if you're into, cereals like I am, or you're into like masks or costumes or other things like that, no one's really gone through and found the licensees, people who work for the licensees. So I think there's so much untapped opportunity in doing this kind of thing if you get outside of the realm of toys. Oh yeah, go back one. This is the Kenner dumpster, by the way. We found some things in the dumpster at Kenner over the years. And so they had this sign up about it's unlawful in violation to remove articles from the dumpster, but we sort of didn't notice that sign until a while later. But we found all sorts of interesting stuff in the dumpster. All right, so another thing I started to do was travel to film locations. I know some of you have been to the Star Wars film locations. What I found shocking when I went to some of the Star Wars film locations was that they left behind so much stuff. And my first trip to Tunisia was in 1997. And they had already filmed episode 1 there, and but I didn't, I didn't want. They had left the Mos Espa set. I didn't do anything to take anything off a set. Like, I always felt if they left, things behind that were, part of a set, that's not cool. But there were a lot of things that got kind of sold or taken by people, once they went to these locations. Like, for example, up in the upper right, you see a huge Krayt Dragon bone from the Krayt Dragon skeleton from the first Star Wars. And with my first trip to Tunisia, it was like, wow, there's pieces of fiberglass bone out in the desert. And so we brought that back. And I ended up doing 4 trips to Tunisia where I found Krayt Dragon bones pretty much every time. And on one of the trips, went with a friend who's done a lot of international deals and shipping of like large quantities of stuff. And we bought a lot of the set dressing from episode 1 that had been sold to a local merchant as scrap. And we basically filled a whole container and a truck with a bunch of stuff from the set of episode 1 that had already been taken away from the set and shipped that to Seattle. And so it was like really like, again, like the kind of thing the average collector would not think of doing and would think is too extreme. But it was like, again, I was like challenging, like ask the question, why not? Like, why couldn't we do that? There's all this stuff left behind. It's on this guy's lot. In the middle of the desert, like just go buy it off of him, ship it back, and that's what we did. And it's literally a ton of stuff from Star Wars, and I've only sold several pieces of it, and just selling several pieces of it paid for everything, like the shipping and all the cost of it. But it was one of those things like pushing the boundaries of what people expect in collecting. But I managed to go to a lot of the film locations, and so Skellig Michael, where they filmed Force Awakens and Last Jedi, and then Fantha in Norway, and and I don't only go there to find set dressing and props. I just love going to those locations, and so that's a fun aspect of Star Wars that I've done. But prop collecting for me came very late. So one of the earliest pieces I did pick up was the Death Star model, and that's itself its own long story. But basically, there were these collectors who had basically discovered the Death Star. It had almost been thrown away for eternity, and they had saved it. And these collectors, based in the middle of the United States, had this for about a decade. And I just told them that if they ever decided to sell it was 3 guys that sort of co-owned it, let me know. And that opportunity came up in 1999 after I knew them for a few years. And it was this weird timing where I just said, you know what, I'm going to splurge on this thing. I don't really collect props, but I want to have like one big piece from Star Wars. And there was a bit of naivete that I was like, well, I want one big piece. And I was like, yeah, Death Star would probably be a good piece. But it didn't really dawn on me, like, this is probably the piece in Star Wars. It's hard to imagine, like, singular item that is, like, more significant in Star Wars. So in hindsight, as, like, sort of collected props years later, I was like, it's all kind of been downhill since the Death Star, because it really, nothing really holds up to it. But yeah, and sort of the point here is obviously the Death Star is gone and in my collection where I love having it. But in every area and focus of collecting, there are these crazy opportunities that come up. And so part of the lesson I have for collectors there is know when to splurge. Like, it may not be the Death Star, but there's other opportunities each of us have that are unique. And sometimes it's the regret of not taking that opportunity and buying this like crazy thing that just seems expensive at the time, but it's like, what? I don't think there's anything like it in the world. And so that was for me like one of the best examples of that. So another kind of role played was in doing the collecting track for celebrations. This was something that started really organically. Like I contacted Steve Sansweet a few weeks before the first celebration, and I said, what are you guys doing for collecting at Celebration? Like, do you have anything planned? He goes, no, actually we have nothing planned. How'd you like to run something? And I'm like, there's only like a few weeks left to Celebration. Like, how can we plan something? And so the first celebration, we were actually outdoors in the rain in a tent with no AV, and just had collectors just speaking to an audience that's sitting in sort of drain-wrenched audience waiting to get into these leaky tents at Celebration 1. So the first celebration was a bit rough, but ever since then, I've always viewed it like Celebration collecting track as something where, I know several of you have participated in it, as something to be like, almost like a mini convention within Celebration. And one of the things we're really proud of at Celebration collecting track is, I've done presentations in all these different rooms at Celebration in big halls and different talks, and the collecting track fills the room every time. Like, and we get such enthusiasm for it, and it's one of the most successful areas of Celebration, I feel, and part of it again is this theme of community coming together to build something. Like Celebration has generally been grassroots and community driven, but the collecting track really embodies this. Like it is really a community effort, and so it ends up being a pretty good part of Celebration. We do things like giveaways, we've done an art show, and over the years I tried to make it more than just panels, like have it be like a mini convention within Celebration. So one of the things that sort of comes up with every collector is, where the hell am I going to put all this stuff? And you know, there's a lot of stories about like when my wife and I were trying to, like we had both, like I fortunately had convinced my wife to get into collecting on her own and different things outside of Star Wars, so that sort of helped me rationalize a lot of craziness. But we were in a 2-bedroom apartment, had several storage units, we had all this crap before we ever bought a house. And so house hunting for us was always kind of a fun thing, because we needed to have like a massive amount of space. And so, and we drove like our real estate agent crazy, because we had like particularly needed a space for the Death Star. We had to have and so when we finally found a house that had this foyer with this like huge rectangular area, we're like, oh my God, this is like the perfect house. The Death Star can go right here. And we're getting out the tape measure, and we're like, yep, this is the house. But you know, we wanted, you know, lots of rooms. I had like 8 dedicated rooms for Star Wars. We needed lots of wall space for things that were framed and hanging up. And then we also decided we'd put collectibles in the living room and dining room. Everybody, of course, has a different, unique taste for how you want to do. Like some people don't like having their house immersed in Star Wars. I get that. Some people want to have a Star Wars room or a Star Wars basement or a separate building and not have anything in the house. But so there's different tastes to it. But I do believe that the decoration and how you display it is a huge part of it. A lot of collectors spend all this time and money getting great stuff and don't think about how you can ever see the collection. And to me, this is half of it. How I display it and appreciate it. I actually don't. I have a few things packed away, but most of my stuff's on display. And I find once things sort of make it off the wall and aren't in a display case, I don't really want them anymore. If I can't see them, I don't really enjoy them. So, but each collector is different. But I think this is an area, you know, I could spend hours talking just on this subject, but I think is a huge part of collecting, is thinking about how you can enjoy the space. And here are just a few things I have in the house. Like this is the Princess Leia costume from Return of the Jedi. Of course, it gets its own dedicated display case, and you need to do justice for something significant like that. On the lower left, there is a set of coin prototypes and artwork from the Kenner line. That is simply just IKEA cases, like cheap display cases to just hold lots of items. And then this is the cereal room. I collect Star Wars cereals. I have a whole room just dedicated to it. And again, there it's just like, okay, I want to have display cases that really bring out the best of the cereals, but there's over 2,000 different cereal boxes they've done since they started doing Star Wars. So you'd have to have the Louvre to be able to fit all of the Star Wars cereal boxes on display, so I just have the highlights of it.
It's more in the car.
So a lot of things what I did with displays is just use a lot of different companies. Like, so for plastic display, acrylic display cases, use local plastics companies. I would use a local museum framing shop that specialized in doing really quality framing for museums. There was a company, Creative Laser Solutions, that Prop Store of London uses to do prop framing, and they're really good at doing like laser mats and having hinged frames where you can access the piece. But I think the display of stuff is equally important. Like my framing shop, at this point, they know me quite well because I go in there several times a year. But like I try to do bold matting and do conservation framing and really put a lot of time and effort into the quality of the framing. It's super important for great pieces to really, do justice to display great pieces. And then so another theme that, sort of talk about in my collecting is, here are some of the areas that I collected. So cereal boxes, cast and crew items, and up the upper right are like gold and platinum records from the soundtracks and the narrated records. And when I got into these areas, hardly anyone was collecting this stuff. Nobody was into these categories. And I collect stuff, like my theme is always to go after stuff that's challenging. And a lot of times I would go into a new area that other people weren't collecting. Whereas a lot of other collectors, what they do is they emulate what everybody else is collecting. And when I go visit people who have collections, a lot of times they'll say, oh, I almost don't want to show you my collection, I'll feel embarrassed. I'm like, why? If your collection reflects your taste, there's nothing to be embarrassed about, it's something to be proud about, because every sort of collection is unique. The only collections I find boring are the ones where people just have to emulate what everybody else is doing. Because I think that's the only boring thing in collecting. But a lot of what I did was just go after categories that people at the time, now in hindsight, there's a lot of people doing food stuff now, there are a lot of people doing cast and crew, but at the time, no one was doing them. And one of the areas I've done some stuff in is yearbooks, like getting old high school and college yearbooks from people, the actors in the films. And not that many people collect those from Star Wars. They're actually not that hard to collect, but they're incredibly rare to find. And so that's something I've just been collecting over the years, haven't really made a big splash about it, but there are a number of categories like that I just sort of delve into that I know are hard, really interesting, and novel, but are untapped. And so my advice to people is find what you like, and sometimes there are these untapped areas of collecting, and I've seen it many times over where people explore one aspect of collecting that people hadn't really thought about. And I think that that's always an opportunity for people to just find new turf. The original props and costumes, just very briefly, I came into this later. I got to a point where, like owning stuff from the original films was like, wow, I can do that. And some of it was, basically there were some stories like Brandon Allinger, who now works at Prop Store. He and I went to where they filmed Return of the Jedi in Northern California. And we found a guy who basically worked on Return of the Jedi who took the indoor bunker with him when he was done. And so he used it as his backyard fence. He had it, so these panels behind me are like the backyard fence. And we bought the guy a new fence. And then we drove the bunker back to Seattle. Or this Ewok mask was just a random guy who played a random Ewok, and he contacted me over the internet and said, hey, I played such and such Ewok. Do you want to buy my mask? And so, for me, it was sort of almost accidental. I started getting into prop collecting. But, one of the things I did in prop collecting is a very unique space of collecting. Most prop collectors are not billionaires. What they do is they buy one or two pieces a year, and they just don't buy something every week. They're saving up for the next big purchase, and they do a lot of trading, or they parlay one thing they have to trade up to the next thing. So it is an area that at first I was a bit intimidated about because it was like high price points and how do you prove the authenticity of items? But I soon learned there was a really great community of people that shared knowledge, and you could bootstrap your way into this area of collecting. And then the books, that Duncan and I have written several books. Like one of the things, I found over the years of doing this stuff, and many of you have delved into different aspects of Star Wars collecting, was that a lot of the mainstream books on Star Wars don't cover some of these areas like prototypes or the micro collection or cast and crew items. And so, again, it was sort of a way for us to sort of give back and share knowledge. And I am super encouraged by seeing more and more collectors start to do this. You've seen in recent years at a lot of the conventions, particularly books about collecting in different countries, which is one of the things I've really enjoyed seeing. There are examples of that from Spain and from France and Argentina, and there are more of them coming. And so that's something that's super exciting for me. But yeah, I think that this is one of the things, and it's getting way easier for collectors to write their own books. Like self-publishing is an option for many people. And it doesn't appear Lucasfilm is very focused on collecting right now, so it's really the collecting community that really needs to be driving this.
Hey man, it's me, Kevin Smith, Star Wars fan, Fantha Tracks fan.
One of the other points I make sort of in the journey is adapting to change. So a lot of collectors get sort of wedded to a way that things work today. Like they learn the prices that they bought things for in the 90s, and they say, okay, well that's too much for a sandcrawler now. Sandcrawlers used to sell for this amount. Or they collected prototypes at a certain price point, but then didn't adapt to the very dynamic and changing world of collecting. And so basically, my advice to people is that, things change. So for example, there are a lot of collectors now with deep pockets, and they can afford very expensive things, and so that changes the landscape. But what it also means is those things you bought years ago for nothing, you can sell those and then buy those things that are very expensive. So some collectors had a real issue adapting to this, there were some examples like this in the lower left. This is a wood pattern to the Sandcrawler, so it's a 2-up wood pattern. It's basically a wood sculpture of the original Sandcrawler toy. And this came out of a pattern shop in Michigan And I worked on getting this closed with this pattern shop for 14 years. And so I was like relentless on calling these guys and trying to get them to sell the wood patterns to a bunch of the Star Wars vehicles. And for years, their prices were just so ridiculous. It was just completely no way we were ever going to do a deal. And so we didn't make progress. But it got to the point on this stuff that the market caught up to these guys, and it eventually became very, very reasonable to get these things. And so I just jumped on it, but it had to sort of adapt my thinking to be able to close that deal. One of the things, one of the other comments I wanted to make about my collecting is when I was younger, I had more time. I published on the news groups, and I wrote a lot more articles and so on. And a lot of us get busier as we get older, but it doesn't mean that sort of collecting energy has to change. Like you can, like many of you get known in an area of collecting. You get more incoming things. Like you have to do less work to find the things you're looking for. Collectors know what you're looking for. They help you and they give you leads, and you get more leveraged. Or you get to a place where you have less time, but you have more money, so you can do that trade-off sometimes. Like you can spend less time online every night searching for deals on eBay, but you might have to spend more when you do get those opportunities. But my point on this is, I work a very hard job that's very demanding, that takes a lot of hours of my life, and I still spend a lot of time on collecting. Like I think that when a lot of people tell me, like, where do you find the time for collecting? I'm like, I don't know anyone who works more hours than I do, and I still do a ton on collecting. It's just you have to just figure out that balance. But I still pour a lot of time into my collecting. Not like I used to as a student, but still a lot. And then a few comments on like losing interest and so on. Like I think Advance had a couple more. Like without spending too much time on this, I think, as I said, like your tastes change over time. I think it's fine to prune things that you're not interested in. Some people then over the years find more space. They move to a bigger home, or they build, like we did, an extension to our house to have more display space, because we just didn't have enough with 8 Star Wars rooms. And so, but like, a lot of people say to me, how do you stay inspired? How do you stay interested in collecting for so long? It's like, well, I focus on novel things, and that keeps it fresh. There's always a new frontier, and so I keep challenging myself to, for example, I have a whole bunch of prop masks and helmets, and they were starting to clutter up the house, and I'm like, right now I'm going through a fresh redo of that. And the upshot of it is going to free up space and have a more amazing display, but it keeps it really exciting. It doesn't keep it static. Even though it's some pretty cool stuff that it could be pretty happy with, you can always make it better. So we did an extension to our house to solve the space problem, but of course it never really solves it. So advance to the next slide. And then, I've done things like run. This is something I've seen other people start to emulate. I had this idea a few years ago, 5 years ago, to do this event in Seattle where we invited collectors just from all over the world to come descend on Seattle and tour a lot of our collections. And basically, we did a bunch of fun things. Like we did a screening of Return of the Jedi. We did road trips to Star Wars shops. And we got about 150 people to do this, and it was just a fun thing that our local community wanted to do, and it brought collectors from all over the world, which we were startled by that we would draw people from all over the world, but we did. And what's been interesting is other cities in the United States have now done these events, have hosted these events, and brought collectors in from all over the world. So it's another example of like sort of thinking out of the box and trying to do something creative with collecting. I would argue, I think Farthest From show is a great example of this. It's unlike any other convention, really, if you think about it. Most conventions follow a fairly standard sort of template, and this is about, a specialized area of collecting, it isn't about like a large event, it's about sort of a quality event. And so it's like, I think that is a really important aspect of being creative and collecting. And so, just sort of in a nutshell, what I sort of covered here is just sort of the themes in my collecting about, like, without sort of rehashing all of them, but it's about, budgeting your stuff, leveraging your buddy network, adapting to change, having a balance in your life with your career or your education, passing on, your information you've learned, I think of one more slide here. And then, also keeping sort of inspired by it. Like, for me, I'm always changing it and revising it and focusing. And I think that's an important part to stay interested over the long haul. But other themes were like, things like the Death Star come up, important once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, seize those advantages. Spend as much time and effort in how you display your stuff, but also adapt to change. And so, so anyway, what in a nutshell, what, I come back to sort of I started with, which is, I think collecting isn't about specializing and being great at one thing. It's about mastering sort of a range of stuff. And when you sort of unpack it in layers, you see that it's like, you can apply those things incrementally over many years, and you see the sort of richness and diversity we now have in collecting. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that quick sort of tour. That's sort of my last slide, and thanks very much for having me here.
Hey? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much, Gus. Yeah. Don't go too far. So, what we're going to do is effectively just open it up as an informal Q&A for Gus. That was really insightful. And the thing that I took away from that is that it is okay to prune your collection, because Bendems really don't have a space in some people's collections. If you catch my miss. That was really great, because it's one of those things that in elements of things like at the collecting track, you've only got so many slots, and you're trying to cover as many bases as possible, and you want to give as much opportunity to people coming in and talking about stuff without necessarily having the same people go over the same same subjects each time. And it must be difficult for you that's a story that's brilliant to hear, but most people don't really get the chance to see that, because you probably think, no, I don't want to do that, I need to concentrate on and open it up for other contributors. So I'm really grateful for that. But does anybody have any questions for Gus? Let's go with Richard.
Right, after everything we've just heard there, I've just got two words. Gus, why?
So why,
why?
Why? Well, I mean, it's hard to answer, actually. I just, like many of you, just love Star Wars and love collecting, and I've tried to apply, a lot of the things that I've done in either other collecting interests or in other ambitions to just how can I just push the envelope in collecting? And so, like many people, I connect to Star Wars on a bunch of levels: the nostalgia level, the thrill of the hunt, finding the novelty of discovering new things. There's a lot of aspects to what motivates me to do it, but not a single one. But I think for many people, Star Wars hits them in a different way. But I love all those things. They sort of all factor into my interest in Star Wars.
Is there one piece you've sold off when you've had a purge that you wish you hadn't done?
Yeah, there are definitely some pieces I've sold off. I can look back to, as you guys know, toy prototype stuff is now super expensive. I used to, back in the day, so a lot of times we'd do trips to Cincinnati, we'd get a bunch of toy prototypes, and we'd try to quickly just sell off ones we weren't interested in and make some of our money back. But at the prices on today's market, it was a bargain what we sold stuff for. There's a lot of things I regret letting go of, but I don't get too stressed about it, because I look at it as, on the balance, I've done quite well. If you step back, and I think it's true for pretty much everybody in this room, you can get all upset about things you let go of, but the reality is, if you've been in this in the long haul and you've mostly done smart, parlaying of one thing into the other, you probably have come out ahead quite well. And so I don't really stress about it. Earlier today I was showing some people a piece I picked up recently. It's a pretty nice costume piece from Star Wars, and I actually sold something from my collection that's I prized a lot to get that. But in comparison, it's a huge step forward in my collection. And so I don't really regret it. I'd love to keep the piece I sold, but it was totally worth it. And so, I don't know. That's how I look at it. There are definitely quite a few pieces, though, that I look back, it'd be nice to still have it. But on the balance, it's just come out ahead. So that's sort of my philosophy on it.
All the prototypes that you've owned from the toy line, which one do you think Kenner should have really went ahead with?
Ooh, there's so many. I think the 12-inch line, I wish they had continued the Empire Strikes Back series. I mean, those were amazing. Like, I think they were raising the bar with their planned prototypes. So those are top of the list. I mean, there's other examples like the Micro Collection, the Unproduced Droids and Ewoks. There's a bunch of other things like that you could argue they should have continued. The Talking Yoda doll, I think were really great toy ideas. But the 12-inch line seemed like a no-brainer. It's like, they'd already done moderate success with the 12-inch line, and they had planned some great stuff for Empire Strikes Back. So that would be the top of my list, because I just love the quality of the Empire Strikes Back prototypes.
So, Collecting Track 2019.
Yep.
What can we look forward to?
Well, I haven't made any decisions yet we're still getting, panel submissions, which is great. And it's opened up till January, and so I like to have the panel submissions come in as late as possible. It's going to be sort of we have like 20 panel slots. It's going to be the usual mix where there's going to be some new topics. I always try to purposely have new topics and sometimes new presenters, people who have never presented before. So part of it's like taking a chance. It is actually risky to have new presenters, but you don't want to have the same presenters every time. Like you want to have try some new people to present, but at the same time you don't want to necessarily be their first time as presenting in front of 450 people and then be nervous. So we try to balance that. So we'll have some new talks. I really want to push for one of the things I haven't gotten a lot of submissions on, but I want more of is not just talk about an area of collecting, like some category of collecting, but more aspects of collecting. So things about the collecting community or ways of collecting or how it's changed or the demographics of collecting or things that sort of cut across collecting and have panels where it's less about I'm going to show you a PowerPoint, but more about let's have different opinions and debate some topics. So that's one of the things, if you haven't submitted a panel, I definitely encourage you to do it. And one of the things I really want more of that we haven't got a lot of submissions on are controversial topics. And they can be, we've done really controversial ones in the past. Don't mind pushing the envelope on controversy. Like we did one on fakes like a few years ago, and so like having and we called out people who fake stuff, and so we can have that kind of thing. So anyway, I encourage you to submit panel ideas, but it'll be sort of the usual blend. We'll bring back some old favorites, and even the old favorite topics. I usually demand that when you bring back a topic that they change it in some way. It can't be just sort of rehashed presentation. That in some way it has to be different. So that's what I would say to look forward to. But it'll be similar, and we'll do the giveaways again. So a lot of the same structure we've had before.
How do you find the balance between preserving an item and adding something artificial to it?
Yeah, so like preserving what I already have and then extending it. Yeah, I mean, so I have things generally well preserved, and there's a lot of thought that goes into that. Things, are in display cases, and things are framed up. And a lot of times when people bring kids over, they worry about, are they going to do a bunch of damage? I'm like, yeah, actually, anything of real value is going to be pretty much locked behind a case. But as far as expanding it, a lot of times what I do, which is another thing my wife reminds me of, is like a lot of times I buy things without any thought of how I'm going to display it or have room for it. And I sort of solve that later. I'll just deal with that problem once I have the thing. And so that forces for me sometimes to have to be very creative, because there are times where I've bought something and I'm like, there's no wall space for this thing. There's no way it's going to fit anywhere. And so I have to think of what do I got to do here. And then sometimes like, this part of the house has open wall space, or I can take down this frame because I don't really care about this anymore and put it up here. So how I add to it, it's a bit organic. But I do have the house and the rooms organized in certain themes. And so that does actually help a lot. Like I know if I get a cast and crew item, it has to go in the cast and crew room, and it's constrained that way. And I think that having that sort of organization and structure has helped a lot, because it said, instead of like what can happen to some big collections is you start just putting things in random rooms and then it gets just really a mess and disorganized. For me, I have certain places where I have to put stuff and it has to fit in that. And if it doesn't fit, I have to be creative and make it fit somehow. And so I think for me that's worked really well. I know other people have different styles of displaying stuff, but that's sort of what I try to do.
What's your holy grail cast and crew item that you haven't yet got?
Holy grail cast and crew item. Yeah, that one's pretty straightforward. So there's an ILM X-Wing t-shirt that Joe Johnson did some artwork for that you see in a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff in A New Hope. And there are a few collectors that have found those things, but it's been elusive for me. I just have not been able to find one of those things. I really want one. I know I will eventually find one. I know that there are some out there, but it's just I have not been able to find it. And on cast and crew, I've mostly found just about, like I have a ton of cast and crew items that nobody else has ever found. So I'm doing pretty good on cast and crew, but that one t-shirt, I can't seem to ever find it.
How have you found the Disney acquisition? Has that changed your collecting in any way with the amount of new merchandise that's come out?
Yeah, for Disney, briefly, so the way new stuff affects my collection is it's only in certain categories really, cast and crew items and cereal boxes, like food items. The other category, like vintage prototypes or props, it hasn't really impacted as much. Because there's really not much they're adding there. But, on food, it's gotten a bit out of control. I know. Matt especially knows. Food's gotten kind of crazy. If you've ever seen how Disney licenses food products, it's out of control. It's all over the world.
Salad.
Yeah, it's crazy. So with food, it has to be sort of contained because it's a bit unleashed a monster. But I actually think that Disney, it's in good hands. I believe firmly that Disney, that Lucasfilm did a great job for many years, but I think as scaling a brand like Star Wars, Disney's the only studio that thinks about the longevity of brands. A lot of other studios milk a brand for short-term gain and don't think the long game. Disney's very smart about evergreen brands, and they're very smart about scaling licensing to be at a global scale. So I think it's actually in very good hands. I mean, we can point to specifics of like, this was a good decision, this was a bad decision that Disney did, but I think on the balance, it's been way better under Disney. But it's made, particularly on cereal and cast and crew, it's made my life miserable in trying to find everything. Because cast and crew stuff, now in every new film, it's crazy. They have like over 100 SKUs and they have a film every year, so it's like, oh my God, like I have to but I feel compelled, at some point I might have to draw a line and say, okay, just the highlights, but like Disney's made that pretty rough.
How are you
for
going to
me.
put the TV shows?
Yeah, now that's the other, it's like, once they have multiple films a year, multiple TV shows, it's going to be like, forget it to keep up with that category.
How would you deal with the pressure?
The pressure? Well...
Yeah, you know what I mean by that, yeah.
Well, I don't know. I don't feel like, for me, most of the pressure is overcommitted on time and energy. I don't feel like I feel like if I stopped collecting today and acquired nothing else, and I just sat on this stuff for decades, I'd probably do okay. I don't feel like any compulsion to like I need more and I'm behind on this. Sometimes I do feel, I do get inspired by new areas and that gets me sort of energized. But the main pressure for me is really around just demands on my collecting time, for all these activities I do and all that. Sometimes can get overwhelming, but it's more like just pace myself. And a lot of it, very few of the things are really date driven or like I have to meet a certain timeline. So, that's sort of how I deal with it. I think different collectors have different pressures though. I think, I'm less constrained on budget than I was 2 decades ago. So that's not a big pressure thing, but that is a pressure thing for some people. Or the need to be posting daily articles like Star Wars Collectors Archive. One of the good decisions we made early on was we wanted to build a site that would last forever and that didn't have to be like current information. It had to be the information that would last. And so that took a lot of pressure on, like we sometimes get really lazy and publish nothing for 6 months and that's fine. Whereas I think a lot of other sites feel tons of pressure of having to stay current. And so I think it's just different. There's different pressures in collecting. For me, a lot of it's my time commitment is some of it.
filming locations. In the UK, which one would you say was the best to visit for us who can get to it because we live it?
Yeah, best filming location UK. I would say Pinewood. Yeah.
I can vouch for that.
I have to say, I did get an opportunity to tour Pinewood a couple times while they were filming, and that was pretty phenomenal. I got to see the filming of Force Awakens and one of the major battle scenes, and I got onto about 10 sets. That was pretty phenomenal. But the average person is never going to be able to do that. And I don't think I'll ever be able to do that again. It's too hard to get on set while they're filming a Star Wars movie. But Puzzlewood, I thought, was amazing. I think that's a great location in UK. Yeah,
bit muddy, isn't it?
Bit muddy, but it was cool. We found all the major spots where Kylo Ren and Rey were going through there. I think that's a pretty cool location, and it's also one that probably won't change too much in the coming years. There's some of the locations what's it called, Whippendale Woods, where they filmed Episode 1. That forest is already starting to change because it's not a very old forest, and so. I would say the Puzzlewood area.
Was that the one you did near the Harry Potter studios?
Yes, that's right. That's Whippendale. Yes, the one, the forest where with the battle droids and
really muddy one.
Really muddy, and the trees are young trees, so that's evolving really fast. Whereas some places, if you go to Return of the Jedi, where they did the speeder bike chase, which is in a state park in California, those are old growth redwoods that are 1,000 years old. That does not change. Decades later, it looks exactly the same. Whereas newer forests are tougher. They evolve really quickly.
Which global location would you say is the best one then?
Global, I think Tunisia is the best. I mean, immersing yourself on Tatooine is there's nothing like it. I would say close follow-ups to it, though. I think Death Valley in the United States is really awesome because about a third of Tatooine is filmed in Death Valley in the U.S. I would say Fantha in Norway is one of my favorites, although that's a tough location because you're dependent on weather and spotting some of the things is tough. But those would be. I like Skellig Michael. I think is kind of an awesome location, in Ireland. But those would be my top favorites. But I think Tunisia is the best. That is you're on Tatooine when you're there. It's just so spectacular. I encourage people to go there or go there when it's safe to go there.
When's the book coming?
Yeah, well, it is a thing I've talked about, doing a book on locations. I think there have been a few books people have done on location stuff. I think that would be a good one. Now they're filming at so many locations so often that it's you'd have to do a volume every year. But I think it's a subject that needs to be done thoroughly. There have been smaller books that people have done.
On parts, yeah.
Yeah, parts of it, yeah.
Hi, this is Gareth Edwards, director of the best standalone Star Wars film since Caravan of Courage, called Rogue One. You're listening to Fantha Tracks. Enjoy.
I mean, if there's a top 5 most visited sections within the archive, what would they be?
Yeah, definitely the toy prototype stuff gets a lot of the traffic. And of course, recency is a big factor. If you do updates or new entries, that tends to get the most traffic in a unit of time. But really, I think the vintage toys, that's where the heart of it is. Even though we have information about because we do have a database we took the books that Duncan and I did and took the entire database of tens of thousands of items and put that in the back end of the archive. So, it is also a source of every item ever made for Star Wars, but really the traffic is mostly on vintage toys is really the heart of it.
Vintage era, how many entries are on the database, roughly?
Vintage era, is probably in the low tens of thousands, so I'd say probably in the 20 to 30,000 range. There's about 100,000 entries in the database, and it takes off. From special edition on, it just sort of gets absurd. And we haven't actually updated it, so it isn't. We haven't really kept it super current since late 2000s. We sort of organically have updated since late 2000s because it's got kind of unwieldy. But we sort of do it in our own categories. So for example, in coins and cast and crew and food items, I update it in the categories I'm collecting in so I can use it as my own checklist. And then Duncan will update it on certain categories where he's been in a process of adding tens of thousands of photos to the archive. So we've been sort of updating organically since the late 2000s. But mostly dominated sort of special edition on. But I would say it's probably the 20 to 30,000 in the vintage, which is actually a lot, for the vintage era.
If it wasn't Star Wars, what would you be collecting now? Or would you be collecting?
Yeah. Well, if it wasn't Star Wars, I would. I don't know. I'd probably be living a lot better. So much of my disposable income has gone into this thing. Yeah, I don't know. I really doubt I'd replace it with anything else. To be honest, I have other little things I've dabbled in collecting, but never even close in the same passion. But it is interesting. I on that point, I do think Star Wars collectors as a whole are just the honing and the caliber of collecting is above that. I do learn about other collecting genres, and I do think Star Wars collectors in many ways are way more advanced and way more thorough. So it's fascinating to watch when Star Wars collectors delve into other collecting areas, because I think a lot of times they just really do amazing things by applying things they learned from Star Wars. And I've seen examples of this firsthand, but I've also observed others that Star Wars collectors have uncovered a lot of things in a way that I don't think, like I'll give you an example, years ago a friend of mine found a whole bunch of prototype Barbie doll boxes, like proof sheets, and in Star Wars that stuff's huge and really popular, and then we just started to kind of share it with Barbie collectors, and just not much interest. It just wasn't that kind of like thinking sort of on all levels of collecting. Not to say that Star Wars collectors are better or more advanced in other areas of collecting, but I think there's just so much that we've learned in this space that I think other areas of collecting could learn from. Has been my experience.
I would say as a retailer, and Matt will certainly relate to this, both as on the retail side and then being a collector in other different communities, collecting communities. But there are definitely traits in each thing. Yeah. There's transferable skills, but the habits of a Star Wars collector is very different from a G.I. Joe collector, is very different from a Transformer collector, is very different from a My Little Pony collector, and a Pokemon collector, and so on and so forth. And you do start to see literally trends appear within each of those different communities, and like it's quite funny sometimes because you can the Star Wars collecting community is much more social on many levels compared to like say some other areas because it comes back to like what you're talking about, the black hole, living in isolation and envy and stuff like that, but also like you said about prototypes, I can't remember who I was talking to, but it was we were having a discussion about My Little Pony, and actually, Stu brought this up tonight. Now, I'm not a My Little Pony collector, Chloe is, but
lies, deception.
But where the whole peroxide thing has come into action figure restoration in the last few years, it's been prevalent in My Little Pony for like 20 years. It's because the product itself literally degrades. It's not built to last, so you literally get like these brown, almost like mold appearing, and peroxide's been used on that for forever, and it's relatively new. And now all of a sudden there's this huge uproar of like, it's killing plastic, and you shouldn't be doing that. But My Little Pony collectors do literally rip apart the toys to preserve them, because you have like a metal O-ring that fixes the tail on the inside of the product, and that rusts and then actually destroys the tail. So they rip the head off, pull the O-ring out, and then push the tail back in. But like, I can't remember who I was talking to, but he was just like, "That's unbelievable!" And everybody's okay with this. It's kind of, but they do that in their version to preserve it. But he, as a Star Wars collector, was like, God, could you imagine doing that like now? And G.I. Joe collectors, where it's like O-rings, they'll take apart figures and then cobble it all back together. So it'll Frankenstein toy, the toys, because you built those, because they were like modular kits, and the figures. That's seen as acceptable. It's not got to be. it's the pure thing.
Yeah, I don't think there's any absolute standards that apply to every collecting thing, and I do think that, in my view, there's a lot of the history of collecting is an arc for any kind of nostalgic kind of collectible like Star Wars is, where you have like a generation that grew up with it, and then it grows and it plateaus. And Star Wars is a little unique in that it's now spanned multiple generations. If you look at things like model trains, so if you talk to train collectors, a lot of that is a dying collectible. Yes. There was a heyday decades ago, but it's like the people that grew up with trains are just now dying off, right? So everything follows an arc, but and I think a lot of things from previous generations of toys are things we can learn in Star Wars or in other collectibles besides just the toys. I think there's definitely things we can learn from and draw from different. And I think I agree. There's also there's different rules that communities I wouldn't be surprised if as things get more scarce and that the community may evolve to be more accepting of fixing things like touching up. Than we have been as sticklers when we could have the luxury of having choices of buying things in top condition. So things may evolve, but you hit on a really important point is I think the Star Wars community, I think there's two really unique things about Star Wars collecting that I think is very different than other collecting areas. One is it's much more social than it seems in other collecting genres. And the other thing is that in some other collecting, and I know some of this through friends who collect other things, and my wife collects other things, that a lot of other collecting genres, the dominant collectors and the ones that sort of have the voice of collecting are dealers. And Star Wars is interesting that way, and I have nothing against dealers. I've dealt Star Wars myself, right? I mentioned, in building up my collection, I used to deal Star Wars toys, and I think dealing is very important, and a lot of collectors are also dealers. But when you're in a collecting community that's dominated by dealers, there's an inherent conflict of interest as a dealer, and collecting communities where the dealers dominate, and I've delved into some of these. I have a display case, for example, of Beatles collectibles, like vintage Beatles collectibles. And in Beatles collectibles, most of the top collectors and the most knowledgeable people are dealers in that space. And when I've seen it in collecting focuses where the dealers dominated, there's a certain arrogance of you're a collector, so you're not in this sort of strata as the dealers. And I think what's cool about Star Wars collecting is it's pretty much democratized. It's not. There's no there's some collectors are big dealers and some are not. And I think that's one really pleasant thing, that sort of the rules and the prices and the standards and all that are not getting set by people who have a conflict of interest. Every collecting hobby needs dealers, and you have to have a healthy ecosystem of dealers and collectors. But I think that's one thing that's really unique about Star Wars that's, I think, allowed it to be powerful and let the rules sort of be set by the community more so than in some of the other collecting genres.
No, definitely.
Have you ever passed on something and then just completely regretted it to this day?
Oh yeah, there's tons of cases where I passed on stuff. There was. And then there's just stupid things, there was an auction to one of my holy grails, I recently posted in the last couple of weeks about cereal boxes I need. There's over 2,000 cereal boxes they've made, in over 100 countries in the last 41 years. And there's about 30 that I need out of the 2,000. And a few of them, about 6 of them, are these Canadian cereal boxes from 1978 for the sticker offer. So it was on Count Chocula and Blueberry and Lucky Charms and a few of these cereals. And I've been looking for decades for these cereal boxes. They just do not turn up. I have 2 examples from that series, but there's 8 total, and I just have not, no one has them. I had just the 2. Well, anyway, there was an auction that came up about 2 years ago that had pretty much every one of the cereals that I needed. And the guy creating the auction screwed up and buried those cereals behind other images and did a so I actually went through that auction, looked through every listing, and I did not find them because their auction listing was so terrible, and I didn't go into depth in every listing. And then I found out later, and then the cereal boxes went for a song. They went for and so that was very frustrating because it was oh my god, I could have, that was just such a missed opportunity. I should have done due diligence on it, but you can't look at every listing every time. so I can't beat myself up over it. But there's definitely a bunch of those times where I passed up on things and it's like, oh, I should have gotten that. But, again, I sort of come back to, on the balance, I'm doing okay. Because there's lots of opportunities where I hustled and just edged over the line on something and got something that, that was a great opportunity and that, a lot of people fast followed me and just missed out on it. I probably did okay. So I don't try to stress about it too much, but yeah, that does happen to me like everybody else.
I don't know if mine's the last question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Let's do that.
But I just want to say that on behalf of everyone within the community, within the people who read all the books, just to say thank you so much for coming down. It's the third time I've seen you at Farthest From, and it's always great.
Thank you guys very much. I love this show. Love coming back out to it.